The biggest news in Nigeria since the new year started was the 2023 fiscal appropriations that President Buhari signed on Tuesday, and further clarifications provided today by the finance minister and other top government officials. So the new year budget of about 21.83 trillion naira is coming against the background of the country's general elections, heavy debt burden, inadequate revenue, and global economic recession outlook. Discussing all of this and more with me is my panel of Professor Ife, who is the development economist, and Attorney Ejinkeonye, who is a past president of the Abuja Chamber of Commerce and Industry and a past national vice president of NASIMA. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you for coming through for the show tonight. Thank you so much for making it. We appreciate your coming through. Let me start with you, Professor Ken. If Nigeria has gone through at least 2 economic recessions in the past years, how worried should Nigeria be in terms of the latest recessionary outlook given by the IMF for the current year, 2023?
Well, we have to be worried because not just that it might happen in the next 6 months or 1 year, no. We have to be worried because we are so vulnerable to the external sector of the economy. We are vulnerable to the exogenic shocks. And let me explain. If you come to the domestic front, our economy is well diversified. It could be better, but it's well diversified in the domestic front because crude oil economy is only 6.5% of our GDP, and there are so many sectors that are over that. But the external sector is a different story. You have a predominance of oil. Now, crude gives us 79% of our forex revenue, and then you have the gas giving 10%. Now, leaving only 10% to CBN to worry about, which is from diaspora remittance, the foreign direct investment, the foreign portfolio investment, and what have you. Now, that fact is that money that is delayed, that 89% that is coming from crude and or gas, is not, we have no control over the price of those, neither do we even have control over the production volumes. Even when we allocated 1.69 throughout last year, most of the time we were under 1 million. And so there's a lot of hostages to that fortune. The second one, of course, is that we have an import-dependent economy. And what that means is the private sector looks for 4.6 billion or above for import every month. Normally NNPC would get 3 billion and put it through central bank, but they're not doing that now. They're doing cruise swap. So even if they brought all that money, it's still going to be less than the demand from the private sector to import all manners of things. So what do we do? For you to be vulnerable, the vulnerability has been increased because of the export dependence. Now, what that means is that Nigeria is on the transmission belt of any form of global economic shock, or even any shock. It doesn't matter whether it is economic or health or what. Nigeria is vulnerable. Can you imagine why Russia and Ukraine, why would it affect Nigeria, even where we have oil and crude, but they control 40% of gas to Europe. And Europe is where we are going to buy a lot of things. We are going to carry imported inflation back to Nigeria. So however you look at it, because we are just about import, even the 80% of our manufacturing capacity is still dependent on imported raw materials. That however you go, so unless we actually diversify the export base, for example, using the RT $200 billion, it has to be non-oil export program that will rescue this country.
Well, so right now the biggest story is about whether we can use the budgetary cycle to make things work. What role do you think the private sector can play in the whole exercise? Let me ask the former president of Abuja Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Attorney. What do you think?
The private sector has a lot of room to play in the budget cycle of the country. If we really call what we have now a budget cycle, presently, from what we can see, from what the president said yesterday and the presentation the minister did today, it is already obvious that we have planned to fail with this budget. Let us take a second look at the figures emanating from the budget. A budget of 21.58 trillion with capital budgets, there is capital expenditure being far less than recurrent expenditure. What do you expect? Now, where the private sector can come in is in the preparation, conceptualization, preparation, the implementation of the budgets. It is very, very critical that the private sector comes in, because it is from the private sector that the government is going to derive its revenues to fund the budgets, especially through taxation. And it is also the private sector that will feel most impact from the spending of government or non-spending of government in critical sectors of the economy. So how come that the government will not involve such a critical sector in its budgets when this group of people will be the people most affected by the budgets? Now, when you look at the international budget statistics for 2021 from all over the world, though I will commend the present government, Nigeria scores 26% for 2021, which is far higher than pre-2015. So actually, this present government have done something to make it rise to 26%. But 26% for me is still an F. It's still an F anyway. So there's still so much more we can do. And it's only the private sector that can help. Our budget has failed all over the year. That is since I was a baby, the budget has been failing. Just some few days ago was when the National Assembly approved the supplementary bill. So if this has failed, can't we try something different? We can try something different by involving the private sector, which they've not done before. So if they give it a try, maybe something different can come up from this. Thank you.
Interesting. Just what you're saying, I'm going to throw that very quickly to Professor Ken. How do we get the private sector, and some folks talk about the size of Nigeria's budget and that of South Africa. There's 60 million people in South Africa, 200 million or plus in Nigeria. The size of the budget in South Africa is much 3 times bigger or so than Nigeria. So my point is that how can we use the budgetary cycle as a catalyst for real and sustainable development? Is this just about the size of the budget, or that the budget preparation and delivery is essentially in the hands of the public and the civil servants, other than the private sector?
Well, I think, first of all, the size of the budget is ridiculously low because we are looking at 5% of the GDP. So government business is only 5% of the GDP.
So if I'm going to stop you there, allow me to stop you there, Professor.
So it doesn't
Professor, just a quick one. Let me just stop there and ask an auxiliary question. So why is it that we budget so low? Is it that we don't have the capacity to budget much bigger than 20 trillion or 21 trillion? Why is it so?
The reason is because you are constrained by the level of revenue that the government raises. The government is the lowest in Africa at 7% of our GDP, government revenue. Absolutely very low. And the average is about 18%. So we actually need to triple our budget to come anywhere near the expectation of having any influence.
Okay, our revenue needs to go much higher to be able to budget higher.
It needs to go up higher. So you could see that each time government tries to push up the size of the budget, it creates a much wider deficit. For example, where deficit is half, 10.6 trillion budget, it is almost higher than the revenue itself. So it is constrained by the revenue. Obviously, if we receive 3 times more revenue, our revenue will be in the region of 30-something trillion. And then you can now add maybe 10 billion, 10 trillion.
So technically speaking,
and it will all be sensible.
So technically speaking, the Nigerian economy is not running optimally. Simply put.
No. It is by far suboptimal. Because there are so many, if you look at the Finance Act, the 2022, that gives you an eye-opener, because you now seen how they are expanding the net, going for the lottery, the gaming, going for digital assets, starting with 10% eventually, so that you don't scare them away, and eventually you can increase it to 30% over time. Now hitting out on the gas flare, raising it from 30 to 50%, I think they should go to 80%. And then the one that I've been advising government since 2016, 2017 is, I do not see any sense that our central bank says these 43 items can be made in Nigeria. Stop giving forex to it. We don't have it. Now, I wanted the fiscal authority at that time, the minister, I said, augment the fiscal, increase using the levy instrument, because under the ECOWAS CET, we can change those, but we can use the levy instrument to augment the tax, so that you can send a clear message to those importers. Now, we're not going to have that. If you must import these products, pay us more taxes. But that hasn't been done. But now we have 0.5%. So I would hope that they will widen it, and two, they will increase the quantum.
So Ejike, let me ask you about this, because the private sector, you talk about the role that the private sector should play in terms of preparing budgets. Can you unpack that for me a little bit? What role would you want to play? You were once a national vice president of NASIMA, which is the largest body for the Chambers of Commerce, Industries, Mines and Agriculture, as well as the Abuja Chamber of Commerce. What role would you want to play? How do you want to get your folks in the room to be part of the process of budgetary preparation, so that we're all part of the private sector that should lead the budget will be there from the word go?
First, thank you very much for the question. First, what we want is for the government to be open and transparent in its processes. Because when the government is open, honest with these processes, that is when the private sector can come in. Like the budget office, they all know about what they need to do. Like I said before, what the private sector can do is, because we are most affected by the tax drive of the government, and any expenditure the government does in priority areas affects the private sector. So how we can come in is, during conceptualization of the budget, during budget preparation, during budget approval, monitoring, and of course auditing, the private sector can be called in to be part of all these processes. Like the budget that was just passed is an act, is the Appropriation Act for 2023. And from what I know, before the National Assembly can pass any law, there should be a public hearing. There should be receipt of memoranda from the public. So they might as well do the budget process like that to involve the private sector and members of the public. So that is exactly how we can come in.
Okay, great. Professor Ken,
As a matter of fact.
Yeah, please go ahead, Prof.
Yes, as a matter of fact, to be honest with you, the budget office has done the most that it could do in the current circumstances. Why? If you look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act 2007, it provides for, in fact, the higher rating you are getting for Nigeria in the transport is because of budget office. Because what happens is that I speak on their programs, because they do virtual now. Even yesterday is virtual. So they consult at the level of preparation of the budget, and then even when it goes to the House also does open hearing, and people come in there. So there are 2 times I speak on their program, when they are conceptualizing the budget and when it has come back, and then the other one is, if I have time, I can go to the House during the hearing. But the thing is that participation doesn't allow the private sector to actually have a look in. So what we are actually doing is just being there to say a word or two, but it doesn't systematically engage the private sector in terms of its own contribution to the implementation. There are ways. I mean, if you look at this budget, it expects $205 billion from sale of assets, those kind of things, and privatization and all that stuff. But that is a far cry from what you would expect private sector to bring to a huge budget of 20 trillion.
Okay, so the 63 government ministries and whatever revenue agencies are expected to generate just about 3.8 trillion naira of the total budget size for this year. How does that hit you, Tony?
Well, of course, it's like hitting somebody below the belt. It's not a workable. It's not really workable. Just like I said, the budget. We've really looked at it, but we still need to scrutinize the budget very, very closely before we bring up our own views on what we want from the budget. But one thing I need to also need to say is, in as much as I've said that this budget will be very difficult to implement, but I believe there's a ray of hope. If the government can be sincere enough to cut down on government bureaucracy, costs, etc., it will really give us a ray of hope. Nigerians are fighting poverty, but you still see our public servants, our politicians, their fleet of cars are still increasing when you compare that to the private sector. So there's still so much more to do.
Okay, thank you so much for your thoughts. Professor Ken, let me just wrap it up. What do you think could be the catalyst for an effective budget for this year? And do you think the new administration, how much work do you think the next administration will have trying to make the current budget work, transitioning into the new one? 1 minute.
I think his answer is revenue, revenue, revenue. We have a revenue plan which the Ministry of Finance is religiously pursuing and using the instrument Finance Act to continue to smoothen the pathway. But it is just has to be as more aggressive as we have. Of course, we have the PIA that was supposed to have delivered a lot of benefits, but we've just ended up in a situation where we are going to have to borrow 500 billion naira every month just to provide for fuel subsidy, rather than looking at the fundamental costs of that import this thing. I don't think we've even addressed that at all. We're not even in a position to make a change, to dent those figures.
Professor Ken, if you're talking about revenue.
Myself in the private sector, I get a kind of scared, because when you mention revenue, what comes to my mind as somebody from the private sector is taxation.
Okay, now this is a different. Now you guys are taking this conversation out of my hands completely, but it's revenue. So it's going to be a very tough one. Yeah, we can get more revenue if the cake is much bigger. We can all have enough to share. I think we should just go back to the back room and start making a bigger cake for the entire country. Thank you both for your insightful commentaries on the budget and the economy in the new year 2023. Professor Kenny, development economist, and Tony Ejinkeonye, past president of ASIMA and executive director of business development at ESICNet Africa. Enjoy your evening. Thank you very much, everyone. It was nice having you tonight, gentlemen, on the show.